Hello everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Choi. I'm a theory researcher. I focus on economics, and today we're going to be talking about cryptoeconomics and Casper. So let's get to it. So objectives. I have 3 objectives for today. Number 1 is we're going to explore the definition of cryptoeconomics and propose one. Number 2, we're going to review why we're working on proof of stake and Casper. And lastly, we're going to share the latest cryptoeconomic research.
不好意思，现在朝鲜时间已经结束了，大家安静一下好吗？请大家回到自己的座位上，谢谢。
Alright, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So let's go into the specific agenda. So we're going to talk about cryptoeconomics, we're going to talk about Casper, and then 5 pieces of research that we're talking about. So what is cryptoeconomics? This is a new field, and it seems silly that we're defining it. But if you, so this is a suggested definition that I'll go into more detail. So cryptoeconomics, I think one way of thinking about it is that it's the study of secure transmission of digital scarcity and open networks. And it seems like a lot, but let me tell you why I went about defining this. So first of all, cryptoeconomics is not like universally acknowledged. This is a very new field. Some people will go as far to say that cryptoeconomics is not really a subfield of economics, or it's not really acknowledged generally, right? So, and even people that are excited about cryptoeconomics, we have a lot of descriptive definitions of what cryptoeconomics does, but there's no definitive definition on what it is. So building the definition. So we have some candidate definitions. I was kind of doing some research thinking about how do people think about the definition of cryptoeconomics today. And there are some really good places we can draw from. So the Ethereum Wiki says it's the design principle that combines cryptography and game theory to create systems that exhibit a set of economic disincentives or incentives. And we have a couple of other definitions here, one from CESC, from Vlad and Vitalik. And these are really good ways to think about how we think about cryptoeconomics today. However, I want to challenge myself to do one more thing, right? This is still building a definition of a study using the definition of other studies. And there are some challenges with that. A lot of the definitions are going to feel like this is the economics of blockchains, this is going to be the incentives in decentralized systems, and for people like us who are more enthusiastic about the space and have done a lot of research, that makes sense. But if you're coming new to the space, you want to start building from more from lower level primitives so that it makes more sense. And one more thing is that when we define a field of study with other subfields, there's a tension between, hey, is this more economics or is this more mathematics? And I'll try to talk about why it's not one or the other necessarily. So this is a good example, right? If you look at things that we already know and have been studying for a long time, like mathematics or psychology or philosophy, when you look at the definition, it's very simple. It's the abstract science of number, quantity, and space. It doesn't use other subfields of studies. So let's think about what are the things that we know about cryptoeconomics already, and go from there to build a definition. So on the right, I have an image that I like to think about, which is a group of blind men and an elephant. We all know what an elephant is, looks like, what the properties of it are, but if you're just one person and you're trying to see, hey, let me explain to you what an elephant is, every part of it feels a little bit different, but all parts build one thing, right? So let's look at what are the different parts of cryptoeconomics. So one, you have open network of computers that communicate with each other. After that, we also have a mathematical proof that hide information in open communication channels. We also have entities that are maximizing profit against competition. And lastly, we have aligned the interests of individual actors with the incentives of the entire group. So as you can tell, those are kind of thinking about 4 different sub-studies. So distributed systems, cryptography, microeconomics, and macroeconomics. So let's understand the definitions of those so that we don't have to actually use that in our definition of cryptoeconomics. So distributed systems. So distributed systems, one way of thinking about this again is a collection of autonomous, programmable, et cetera, nodes in a network working together, right? So it's easier to think about this in terms of the examples that we're already familiar with. So one, telecommunications, so the internet or cellular networks, but also on the application layer, like the World Wide Web, BitTorrent, MMORPGs. These are all examples of distributed systems that are a family of different nodes that work together to have one system. And it's really a study of communication networks. So when you look at my proposed definition, you can see which part of the definitions are really drawing from that subfield. So you can look at transmission and digital networks. As for cryptography, cryptography simply is secure communication in the presence of third-party adversaries. And this is really important for cryptocurrency, right? This is what enables the asymmetry between a defender and an attacker. If we look at, this is ironically what enables an open network. What enables an open network is the fact that you can be open about your information because you trust cryptography. So again, looking at the proposed definitions, the words secure and open relate to why we're drawing from cryptography. And now let's go to the economics section of this definition. So I'm calling out microeconomics and macroeconomics separately because they're different enough concepts that refer to different parts of cryptoeconomics. So microeconomics is really about individual choice. Why do we make the decisions that we do, whether that's financially or just socially? And some of the concepts that relate to it are opportunity costs, cost of capital, the time value of money, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to be talking about how these elements affect the way we think about Ethereum and cryptoeconomics in general. And lastly, we have a lot of economic concepts here, but a simple way to think about macroeconomics is the study of scarcity. When you have limited number of resources, whether that's time or money, how do we think about working with each other to move the overall economy forward? So that has to do with game theory, where it's more about what I do versus what you do, but it's also about profit maximization. How do we think about building a profitable business? So again, the word scarcity is highlighted here, and this is a little bit tricky, right? When you think about scarcity, you might think, is this an asset, is this like gold? But this really means scarcity in the broadest sense, and we'll talk about how the blockchain revolution is different than the internet in the sense that it's really about the fact that the private key that you have is something that only you have, and that's why anything that we have to do with cryptoeconomics is about the study of scarcity, something that we have that others don't. And lastly, macroeconomics. So macroeconomics is concerned with the large-scale health of an economic system. So the ideas that will come up are inflation, wealth distribution. So if an entire group of people are making wealth, how do we distribute that within the group? And these are all the things that we think about in macroeconomics. And this is subtle, but we're talking about the fact that we're looking at a network. Whether we're not interested in Ethereum as a network, or Bitcoin as a network, or China as a network, or something like that, depends on how the health of the entire network is doing. All the things that you're doing individually change the group dynamic, right? How do we think of that as people that are designing that the incentives are aligned so that what is best for you is best for everybody in the group? So I think this is something that not everyone might agree with, but I think that a breakthrough in any of the components of the four subfields would make an amazing cryptoeconomic model, a winning cryptoeconomic model, and vice versa. A cryptoeconomic model that does really, really well, but does poorly in one of the subfields will fail. And that's why I think that cryptoeconomics is inherently a subfield of all the four things that we mentioned today, and it's not, can't fight about if this is an economic thing or a computer science thing. And we have some examples here, like the fact that we have a global network of miners that are volunteering their economic resources to secure a distributed ledger. But we'll talk about more examples of cryptoeconomics in this presentation. So briefly, before we talk about Casper, let's think about why this all matters to begin with, right? Why does cryptoeconomics matter? And one simple way to think about this is that blockchains will replace markets. Markets are all around us, right? It's about how we go to a group of people to want something and to get a solution that you need. And blockchains are a unique technology that enables you to do that without trusting third parties. And the reason why I'm personally really excited about blockchains is that the internet, if we look at the past few decades, it really used distributed systems and cryptography to enable an open flow of information. So the information that you have in a PDF can be sent almost costlessly to everybody else in the world. And what blockchains are about is that you can do the same thing, but not with a copy of information, but something with scarcity, something unique, like a token. So it's a token that says, this has value because I have it and none of you have it. If you have the same copy, it wouldn't matter. So that's so key to the understanding of why cryptoeconomics is important. And so that seems grandiose, but more specifically, what does that mean? If we look at the world around us, certain large companies, maybe this is a little bit US-centric, so I apologize for that, but certain large companies did the amazing service of connecting the world, but under their custody. Well, what blockchains are trying to do is that we want to connect the world in the same way, however, in the custody of the participants themselves. And the reason why I'm getting excited about this is that this ethos is really powerful to a lot of people. But the reason why we're talking about incentivization is that this ethos that seems so amazing won't work unless the cryptoeconomics or the incentivization piece works, right? An idea is not good enough unless everybody can go home and say, well, actually, that was a good deal for me. And we want to actually tune a system that says everyone thinks this is a good deal to participate, and at the end of the day, the overall group is better off for having participate. And I'll end this section with two quotes that I like. That you really cannot reason about security of a blockchain consensus protocol without thinking about economics. And this is one of the reasons why I got so excited about working on Ethereum, is that out of a lot of the teams that are working in this space, there aren't that many teams that really focus on incentives and economics. And I think that computer science and the overall technical distributed systems technology is really fascinating. However, what's going to bring it to the forefront of the real world for real world applications is going to be a mindful economic application. And lastly, another quote from Naval about cryptoeconomics. I think what's really fascinating, again, I studied economics more formally, but this is different because we can actually design systems. It's not just about looking at what the US and China are doing economically and observing. It's about observing and then saying, well, how can I actually design a system that does better? And the feedback loop is so quick, quicker than anything else I've seen in traditional financial markets. So I leave you with this proposed definition. I'm sure as an ecosystem we'll kind of continue to iterate on the definition, but I just wanted to have one opinion. And with that, we can add to the personal dictionary of cryptoeconomics. It's not really good knowledge, but let's continue now on to Casper and proof of stake. So how many of you guys here have heard of Casper? How many of you guys have heard of proof of stake? Okay, cool. That gives me some good context. So Casper, quite simply, implements proof of stake in Ethereum. But only about a third of the room has heard of proof of stake. So we'll talk briefly about what proof of stake is. So let's leave this for a second. But if you look at Bitcoin today or Ethereum today, it uses proof of work. And what that means is a network of miners are showing to the network that you can trust the version of the legend that they have because they have a proof of the work that they're on this node. So what proof of stake is trying to do is that instead of burning a lot of energy and using hardware to show to the network that you're a node that can be trusted, what we're saying is that the proof of stake, let's use instead of realized costs, like energy or hardware, and say, well, we actually are incentivized just as much by the concept of losing money as much as actually using money. So we'll go into more detail about that, but that's a group. Is this too loud? Okay. So with that, let's talk about our version of proof of stake. Casper has been going on since I think 2014 or so. It's been a long effort, and Ethereum from the beginning was really thought of as like, how are we going to have a proof of stake base cryptocurrency? And this FFG, we'll talk about the differences in the different implementations, but this is one of the ways that we want to introduce an aspect of proof of stake into Ethereum. This is a lot of bullets, but because not a lot of the audience has heard about proof of stake, I won't go into too much detail here. But the simple way to think about this is that Ethereum today is proof of work, and we're going to transition over to proof of stake in the long term. But this is a hybrid implementation that is a transition over to that. So the way that we're going to do that is imagine a proof of work chain that is the root chain. And every block is going to continue in the same way, but we're going to have an overlay on top of that that is proof of stake. And as you can see in the slide here, every 50 blocks is going to be what's called a checkpoint. And that's the checkpoint is where the proof of stake validators, which is similar to the proof of work miners, can collaborate on, hey, what is the latest state of the distributed ledger? And a quick little shout out, this presentation is really going to be about the rationale and the cryptoeconomic research, but if you're a developer, if you want to better understand how FFG is going to be actually implemented, check out Carl Flourish's presentation on proof of stake in FFG. So with that, let's move back to why we're doing Casper, why proof of stake is important, and things of that nature. So there are a lot of ways to talk about why proof of stake is important, but I've simplified it to three main reasons. So I would say it's energy efficiency, decentralization, and mechanism design. So let's talk about the thing that you hear about the most, which is energy efficiency. So we'll do a quick economic detour. So who here has taken like Econ 101 before? Okay, cool. So this is a complex graph, but the only two things that you really need to look at is this curve and that curve. And if you see the label, it says marginal private cost and marginal social cost. So the only thing that you need to understand about this is that when we make decisions, sometimes I make decisions for what's good for me. But maybe that won't include what's good for everybody or for the environment and things like that. So in economics, we think about the difference in the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost of the actor to understand, hey, is there an inefficiency here? Because everybody acting on behalf of themselves actually is not good for everybody in the long run. And the reason why I'm talking about this economically is that when you look at Bitcoin, we can say Bitcoin is an amazing technology, and Ethereum is an amazing technology, but it's burning a lot of energy. Bitcoin mining consumes more energy than 159 countries today. And to extent that we're still in the early days, this is a little bit of an outdated slide, but Bitcoin over there is looking at $100+ billion in value. But if we are really trying to achieve the vision, the long-term vision of cryptocurrencies, we're going to be in the trillions of dollars, competing with percentage of gold stock or M2 supply, and that is a very long way to go. And if we were to achieve the full vision, you can imagine how much more energy we would have to use. So going back to the idea of private costs and social costs, we need to think about, hey, if this is really a good technology for us, is there a way to do this without burning as much energy so that we can have a more environmentally conscious way forward? And a quick counter-argument, right? So a lot of people that work on proof of work consensus will say, well, there's a thing of social scalability, and Nick Savo in his blog, in Enumerator, talks about social scalability, and this is a really important shout-out, right? Which is, I think my understanding of it is that there's a benefit to you and me being able to collaborate. And the value of you and me being able to collaborate warrants certain costs. And he might say that if Bitcoin is providing the service of me being able to have money that cannot be censored, then maybe that's the cost that we have to pay for proof of work. But that's a much longer topic, but very quickly, maybe we should think about, is there ways to create social scalability without having realized costs or environmental costs? So a little bit of a thought experiment. So I was flying over here from Seattle, and I was thinking, well, usually when I ride the subway, I go to the counter, I pay the ticket, I get the ticket, and everyone does this, and you go to the turnstile and you put in your ticket, and every single person that rides the system has to interact with somebody. But in Seattle, what's weird is that they don't have turnstiles. They don't have people working the counters. They just have open ways to go, and you just buy a ticket yourself. And I was wondering how this works, and the reason why this works is that if you are caught without a ticket, the cost of that will be hundreds of times larger, or tens of times larger, so that you're trusting, you're making a view on what you think human nature is. Well, do I think that if I caught them, they would actually really hate that, so they would just buy the ticket up front? And if you do believe that, then you save a lot on cost, right? You're not putting one or two people on every single station in the entire network. You don't have turnstiles that you have to upgrade hardware for. So while different, this is the kind of analog we're thinking about with proof of work versus proof of stake. Can we use the incentives that humans have instead of realized costs, such as hardware and energy, to make things happen, like securing a distributed ledger? So that's energy efficiency. And while a lot of people talk about, hey, saving the environment is good, I think that's too simplistic, because if there are certain things that we can get with using more energy or using more power, we should do that. It's a very nuanced question, but the question really is, can we incentivize it with risk of loss rather than realized cost? Because risk of loss doesn't actually cost anybody anything. Decentralization. So there's going to be another economics detour. Who here knows what economies of scale is? Okay, so very few people, so let me talk about this real quick. All that economies of scale means is this fancy way of saying that the bigger your organization gets, the lower the cost might be. So what that might mean is that, hey, if I'm one person and I want to take a trip somewhere, I might need to get a rental car and I have to pay for the entire car. But if you're a group of 4 people, then you can get the same rental car, you divide it across 4 people, and the cost is like about 1/4. And you can continue to do this until you understand what the scale of like Amazon may be. They're going to have much lower average costs than a small shop that's across the street. And understanding economies of scale is really key for understanding why, how decentralization can be maintained. So economies of scale works in 2 ways. Amortizing fixed costs over a larger operation, and having bargaining power as a larger entity. We already talked about amortizing a fixed cost over a larger base. But bargaining power means that, hey, what if we all wanted to buy something? And we go to the store, and I say, well, I would like to buy this iPhone, please. But if we all went to a store together and said, hey, if you can make a deal, I will buy 1,000 iPhones today, you might be able to bring down the cost of every average purchase by negotiating together, right? So those are the 2 ways that economies of scale works. And more concretely, for a miner, that might say your rent per square foot is much cheaper, or your power cost is much lower. Or you might have to use, instead of hiring 1 person and they manage 100 servers, they can manage 1,000 servers. And another example of economies of scale, the more you use in terms of, for example, AWS storage, the cheaper your dollar per gigabyte cost might be. So why does this matter for consensus protocols? This means that 2 sets of mining pools that have the same economic cost might have a different hash rate. So that means that with the same number of dollars that are being invested, you might have more influence over the network than the other person. And that is a distortion in terms of centralization, right? Whereas with proof of stake, what we're trying to work on is a dollar is a dollar. And I know this is a contentious topic, but let me explain. I'll explain what I mean by this. It means that even if you pool together your money, let's say me and you work together and say, well, hey, I think like this economies of scale thing will help with mining, so why don't we try this with validating? But even if I pool my money with your money, at the end of the day for proof of stake, your vote is deposit weighted. Deposit weighted meaning you're only as valuable as how much of the total deposits you're actually contributing to the pool. So whether you're 100 people investing $1 or one person investing $100, every dollar is a dollar. And we'll talk about the subtleties of that a little bit more. So you're going to see this a lot, another economic detour. So when we think about taxation, right, we can think about, hey, how much money do I make versus my neighbor, and what is the tax rate that I get versus my neighbor, whether they're richer than me or poorer than me. So there are three concepts. We have progressive, proportional, and regressive. And when we look at most liberal countries, you'll have a progressive taxing system. And all that means is that if you make more money, you're going to pay a higher tax rate. And therefore, you see that as you scale up, your taxes actually go up. Versus the regressive tax system is where you actually pay a higher tax for making less money. And proportional is when you have it purely depends on your percentage, right? So it is, if you make $100, you get taxed 10%. If you make $1,000, you get taxed 10%, etc. So the reason why we're thinking about this is that while proof of stake isn't progressive, it doesn't actually help you if you're less rich than your neighbor. But it gets as close to proportional as it can be. What that means is that proof of work, because it is regressive, meaning it has economies of scale. If you're richer, you get a better rate. It is a regressive wealth distribution mechanism. Whereas if you have a system that is dollar for dollar, you get pretty close to being proportional. Because yes, if you are richer, you're going to get more absolute dollars, but as a percentage of how much you're putting at risk is the same percentage. So decentralization is really about diminishing economies of scale, among other things. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Explicit economic security. Explicit economic security is really a simple concept that with proof of stake or anything where you go from scratch, you have to recreate a lot more work. So for example, when you're in proof of work, you have a implicit cost assumption. So depending on how much energy you're wasting, or depending on how much hardware you're actually showing up to the network with, we can kind of assess, hey, this is how serious this miner is. And that is an implicit determination from how much hashing power that we see. Whereas for proof of stake, is a very explicit state, right? Where we're saying, instead of saying, I'm going to show you that I have this much hash rate, I'll just show you that I have $1 million that I want to stake, right? When you have that kind of explicit economic security, POS may be more challenging to design because you actually have to recreate a lot of the good things about proof of work. In proof of work, there are certain elements that you get from seeing the miner's ability to provide a certain hash rate. But you have to recreate all those things with proof of stake. However, once you do have that, with proof of stake, what you can do is you can have a lot more customized understanding of, hey, in this situation around, we'll talk about later, briefing factor or ulterior factor analysis, maybe we want to tweak the reward or penalty just by a little bit, which you don't have the same level of control in proof of work. So that talks about why proof of stake is important to us, but let's talk a little bit about Casper. So for why Casper matters, a lot of why Casper matters has to do with why proof of stake matters. But there's two different things that I'd like to add around scaling Ethereum and a gentle transition over from proof of work, which is why Casper is additionally important. So finality and scaling. So Choi here talked a lot about our sharding proof of concept earlier. So I'll keep this section a little bit short. But the TLDR on this section is that people hear finality and think, well, maybe that means that my transaction that said buy a coffee or buy this digital asset or buy a home can be final quicker. And that's a common misconception, and that's a misconception that I have as well. And a lot of the benefits of explicit finality that comes with Casper actually helps us scale rather than getting your transactions finalized quicker. So one example is that when you look at when your Ethereum transaction is finalized today, you might say, I'm going to wait X number of confirmations before I feel comfortable then this is finalized. But when you look at our proof of stake implementation, you'll notice that it takes 2 epoch times to finalize a transaction, 2.5 actually, and that's actually 100 to 150 block times. And that's much longer than what we're already comfortable with in terms of accepting transactions. So you'll quickly realize, hey, this is actually not helpful in terms of getting my transaction finalized quicker. So again, it's really talking about, in Choi's charting presentation, if we have a different universes, a set of universes that are adding up to one ecosystem, you're splitting up a lot of the economic security across different shards. So when each of those shards have another tool around explicit finality, you don't have to look back in a probabilistic chain across to the entire, into the genesis block. You can just look at, hey, what's my last finalized checkpoint, and I can just go from there and have a security from that point. And I touched on this briefly a little bit, but it's a stepping stone to pure POS. Because Ethereum has had so much traction in the market, it would be very difficult to just go in one step to pure POS. So FFG is a transition system. And again, apologies, I mentioned FFG before actually disambiguating what's FFG versus TFG. And we just have a two-set of different work streams under the Casper umbrella, which is about proof of stake in Ethereum. And all you need to remember is there is FFG, which is a hybrid proof of work, proof of stake consensus mechanism. And this is going to be the one that's being tested currently, and we're planning on rolling it out soon. Versus the friendly Ghost, which is a pure POS proof of concept that Vlad is working on. And there's a lot more information available online about this as well. So we talked about 2 different Casper implementations, but let's think about what are the shared design principles that they have. When you take a gander at these items here, you can tell that a lot of them are actually economic. They're not about how proof of work works versus proof of stake. It's not about miners and validators. It's really about economics, meaning, hey, how can we use economics to incentivize each validator to do something versus not do something? How do we maximize the cost of attack to defend the economic value of our constituents? And this is really a testament to how much we do care about economic incentives, like I mentioned before. And we'll talk about how those actually come up in the latest research. Quick little shout out to challenges that there are for proof of stake. Whenever somebody says, hey, something is really amazing and it has no challenges, I get very skeptical. So I want to be very straightforward about the challenges with proof of stake. It's not easy. Number 1, there's a section about adverse selection. A lot of people say that with proof of stake, what you can do is you can be a lot harsher about penalizing somebody if they're wrong. It's not that you just, for proof of work, you just lose the energy cost for that block time. But with proof of stake, we'll take your entire deposit. But that's really tricky because if you're doing that as an honest validator that's trying to join the network, that seems like a bad deal. Like, why would I join a network where if I make a mistake, I would lose all my money? So the extent to which you can actually penalize them has to be very balanced, right? You have to penalize them enough to make it difficult to attack, but not so much that it makes it very difficult for honest validators to join the network. Rich get richer. So this is a common thing we hear with proof of stake. When you hear, hey, we're actually going to validate not with miners and math, but let's just, depending on how much money that you have. It's a very reasonable feeling, right? Hey, are we just going to make richer people, just be validating and make more money? But as we talked about earlier, we can actually see that going from proof of work to proof of stake is an improvement from going from a regressive wealth distribution to proportional distribution. And lastly, high network value. Because Ethereum is so valuable today, it makes it more difficult to roll out proof of stake than from scratch. So thank you for waiting. This is going to be a section on the latest research. We have 5 different things, but they share the same objectives. 1, we want to penalize bad behavior and limit the damage that attackers can do. And we also want to reward good behavior, but more in particular, we want to encourage voting frequently and correctly, but also reward cooperation between the validator sets. And lastly, we want to design an economically sound system and mechanism. So this really is a macroeconomic piece that says we want to limit the dilution to existing ETH holders. We don't want to make this so compelling to the validators, but then it's actually a bad deal for everyone else. let's talk about participation constraint analysis. It sounds fancy, but it just means what's our budget. We have a new program. How much money do we have to actually incentivize these people? So we have a set of crypto concepts and economic concepts for this research around block reward, transaction fees, but on the economic side, quantity theory of money. Again, in the interest of time, I'll be pretty brief on this, but when you look at quantity theory of money, you should understand that this is a pretty contentious topic in modern economic theory. But one way to look at it is that there's a relationship between the money supply in an economic system and the price in an economic system. And this is a little bit of an older way of thinking, nonetheless a good way to start this discussion. So the simplified way to look at this is just MV equals PQ. And if you have velocity of money and the quantity of goods being pretty stable over a long period of time, you can see how you can argue that M, the money supply, and P, price in the economic system are correlated. So let's look at inflation for Ethereum. Inflation just means that you're having this much more currency into the system. And that currently is a target for around 15% for Ethereum. But when you compare that to more mature economic systems, such as the US government, that's about the US economy, that's 2% today. When you look at Bitcoin, it's around 4%. But when you look at, late 2013, that was closer to 15%. And you can see that with Ethereum as well. If we continue with the current trend, you'll see that Ethereum inflation might go down to 6% in 10 years and around 3% in 20 years. And this is just a graphical representation of what I just shared. And the tricky part is that that's only mining revenues, right? So if we add validation to it, how does that actually change how much mining rewards are going to be happening? And is it net plus, net positive, net negative? How do we actually transition the percentage going from mining rewards to validation rewards? And this is another chart for Bitcoin. This is very faint here, but you can see it going from very high places from 90% down to 4%. So this is purely illustrative numbers on how inflation and the total deposit range for Ethereum would affect some validation yields, right? So again, the reason why I share the 15% number here is that when you look at the additional inflation that we might be using for rewards, this is just to understand what the ranges might look like. If we add even 0.5% or 1% additional inflation on a different set of total deposits that are securing the network, you can see that even if we have $1.5 million in total deposits and 1% of additional inflation, that would be a 19% yield on average to the validators, right? So from there, we would increase or decrease it depending on your performance as a validator. And this is a very complex topic, but you can kind of show, do we have the budget to make a compelling thing? I believe so, because when you look at US Treasury bills, that's 1 or 2% over a 3-month period. If you look at US equities, that's about 8% annually for the past several decades, so it's very compelling compared to those rates. So again, you can kind of draw analogies from central banking or monetary policy, or the ways that companies manage their share count by buying back shares and making more of the value accrue to the shareholders versus raising more money and issuing more shares. So we talked about what's the budget to run this program. So let's talk about, well, if I have this much budget to allocate to validators, how do I think about what's a fair rate? For different types of validators, when would they decide to participate versus not? So again, we have a share of crypto concepts and economic concepts, pretty similar crypto concepts, and we would add a little bit of VFT, consensus protocol. And on the economic concepts, we have some new things, right? So we talked about participation constraints, which is would I even consider participating in this mechanism, and how do I go about that? And utility is just a catch-all term in economics to talk about how good is something for somebody, like how much do I value apples versus oranges. Risk and loss aversion just means that even though mathematically losing 10% and gaining 10% might be symmetric, people in general actually don't like losing money. So losing money by 5% is actually a worse effect than making money by 5%. and we'll talk about cost of capital and CapEx. So we talked about this already, like, will this mechanism be compelling enough for people to join? And the main trade-off here is around issuance and average returns. Issuance we talked about in the budget, which is the more money that we create for these validators, the more on average, more compelling it's going to be to participate. But, and that's going to increase the average returns. But issuing more is actually dilutive to everybody, right? So we want to limit that. But when we limit that, that might actually limit how compelling this is to all the validators. So let's think about this not from the protocol designer's perspective, but from each validator's perspective. And this is where we look at risk-reward analysis. And the traditional way of doing this in a portfolio is around capital asset pricing model, CAPM, and Sharpe ratio. Can I just get a show of hands if you've ever heard of Sharpe ratio or CAPM? Okay, almost no people. So we're gonna start from this beginning. So let's not start there actually. So let's start here. So this is a modified version of the CAPM model. And what this is saying is, I have an asset, let's say like a share of Apple. And then you have a market like S&P or NASDAQ or something like that. And you want to say, hey, how much is Apple yielding as an asset class? And how much is S&P yielding as an asset class? And how does that compare? And what this term, if you remember one thing from this section, like remember this beta term. The beta term just means if you have an asset in a family of goods, how volatile is the returns of this one asset? Meaning sometimes you make a lot of money, sometimes you lose a lot of money. That's called volatility. And beta is just kind of a concept that says how much more risk am I taking on because the price of this asset is volatile. So I don't want to go into too much detail in this section given the time constraint again, but the main takeaway for me here is that when you look at what a Sharpe ratio is just how compelling something is to invest in. What it has is the rewards on the top, so like yield on the top, and standard deviation or risk on the bottom. So it's just a very simple way to look at what a risk-reward ratio is. So let's say that there are two games that they both pay 10% as a yield at the end of the year, right? So if you ask people like which game would you play, then you would actually naturally ask, well, how risky is each of the game? And this is really innately what risk-reward analysis is trying to do. If you have two games that yield the same amount and one's less risky, that one's way more compelling to participate in than the other. So this is actually informing the way that we think about validator slashing. Even if you have the same validation yield, if you slash people more on average, that becomes a more difficult thing for me to participate in as an actor. Because even in the slip of a mistake, I'm risking losing all my money. I'm actually going to skip this because of time. So simply, if you remember one thing from this section, remember that in cryptoeconomics, it's really not about yes or no questions or whether this is good or bad. Like, saying the environment is good, but at what cost? And vice versa. Like, Bitcoin is good, but at what cost? And the concept behind this is a margin of safety behind the decision, right? I might really enjoy doing something, but if I have enough incentive not to do it, I won't. And as protocol designers and thinking about cryptoeconomics, we have to think about what is that margin of safety that's keeping me from not doing what I'm doing today. So the next two are pretty short, withdrawal delay and long-range attacks. Withdrawal delay, all you need to think about here is around liquidity and value. Liquidity just means I own something, but how easy is it for me to actually get it? So if I have cash, it's the most liquid thing. I can use it today, no one's holding me back. But if I own a home, that's a great asset, it's very valuable, but it's not very liquid because if I want to use that money tomorrow, I just can't go to the market and use that money. So because of that lack of liquidity, different assets have different premiums or discounts depending on their liquidity value. So the reason why we think about this is that in general, we were really excited about proof of stake when we figured out the deposit-based proof of stake mechanism. Because when you have proof of stake without deposits, it's very difficult to solve certain problems around nothing as state problems or long range attack. But if you have a set of validators that are known and you have all of them bonded, right? They have money money deposited. It's possible for us to actually penalize them accordingly. Versus there's a trade-off between that economic security guarantee of that bond for I think the current example is 4 months versus the trade-off between liquidity. So the longer you hold something, the more secure you can be about that validator's economic security, but they're not going to like that because you actually have to wait 4 months to get your money back. So we're actually trying to understand what the optimal balance there is. This is just a curve showing that the more illiquid something is, the more of a discount you have to put on that same asset. I'm also going to skip this section actually, unfortunately. So the last thing we'll think about is the validator slashing trilemma. I think I have to credit Vitalik with helping me with naming this last night. I thought I could come up with it by myself, but needed the help. So the validator slashing trilemma. So if you think about all the things that we talked about today, we talked about a lot, so thanks for bearing with me here. But some of the things we talked about is what is the budget to run a given mechanism via issuance? What is the cost of attack? When you have an open network, how do you think about making attack very expensive? What is the yield for participating as somebody that's securing the network? And as you can tell, there's a lot of trade-offs that we talked about that came up over and over again. And you can see that the trade-offs are really around how do you keep cost of attack very high? How do you make it compelling for innocent validators to join when you're actually penalizing other validators? And 3, how do you lower the total rewards so that if you're not a validator but just hold Ethereum, you don't want to think that this is going to be dilutive to your own Ethereum, right? So this is the way to look at this visual. On the top, you have the high cost of attack that we mentioned, and this one way to think about this is around, okay, how much are we going to slash a given validator if they have Byzantine actions? High validation yield. More specifically, one way to think about this is a positive return or positive EV to a innocent validator. But in general, if you have a high validation yield, it's more likely that it's going to be compelling for everyone to participate. And lastly, low ETH issuance. And the way to think about ETH issuance is around the less. If you can do the same security while issuing less Ethereum, that's better for everybody, right? Because you're not diluting everybody else in the system. So you can see those effects. And really this is about diminishing marginal returns. All 3 things that we mentioned are good. So it's our job to think about what's the optimal balance of the 3 where we make it very expensive to attack. It is exciting for validators to join, and everybody else in the ecosystem is also happy. So future work is going to be around optimizing the parameters that we talked about, writing a paper about the decentralization process that we just shared a little bit here, and optimizing the parameters in test network, and iterating on the mechanism design if we feel like we're missing something. So to tie it all together, cryptoeconomics is the study of secure transmission of digital scarcity and open networks. And we talked about why are the reasons why we think about it that way. And we want proof of stake for energy efficiency, proportional wealth distribution, and fine-grained control over the incentives. And Casper, in addition to the benefits of proof of stake, we also have promising scaling solutions that are available due to it, and also it enables a way to go over in a more gentle transition to proof of stake. So the parting thoughts is cryptoeconomics is really about subtle trade-off between all good things. And there are great things that are okay at a certain price, and there are okay things that are great at a certain price. And we're trying to figure out which ones are those. And I will leave you with that. Thank you.